Welcome to the Signet Podcast. So on today's show, I interview Pam Maass. She is an estate planning attorney. Pam Maass is extremely knowledgeable when it comes to taxes, estate planning, LLCs, incorporating, and different things that you need to know as a business person if you're setting up a business. These are also ways to protect yourself and to limit your liabilities. This is one of my favorite podcasts because not enough people talk about how to protect themselves long term. Enjoy the show. Thank you for watching.
New thing, new style, new walk. Go ahead, take a picture.
Right, here we go. A lot of people are not aware of how important estate planning is, and I've seen horror stories. I know it can be tough to talk about death and what's going to happen after, but it's an incredibly important topic, and I'm really happy to have you on my show. So
yeah, absolutely excited to be here with you.
I heard you talking about your grandmother's story, and that's how you got started into estate planning. Is that where your passion came from?
Yeah, so I grew up in Arizona, and my grandma was a teacher, and she's one of those teachers from the Depression era that saved every penny. And so when she passed away, she had a decent amount, and she went to kind of a large estate planning firm in Arizona. And when she passed away, her estate plan failed, and we ended up in probate court. It cost our family a lot of time, cost a lot of conflict. And I, was back in college at the time, but when I became a lawyer, I looked into it, and I thought the firm had committed malpractice, and I found it's actually very common practice. So everything designed in my firm is to make sure what happened to my family doesn't happen to everybody else or anybody else, and so we do things really intentionally different for that reason.
In estate planning in general, it doesn't just apply to real estate. If you have a brokerage account, if you have an oil company, if whatever it is, you need to be prepared for the future. And it's inevitable. We're all going to, probably, unless something miraculous happens, we're all going to die someday. And, something that, just to talk about my family, my dad's always been very open, and we always talked about it. It was, he was the one organizing everything. And we always talked about what would happen if he passed away. And, we talk about it maybe every year, every 2 years, but it does give him, I'm sure, a certain sense of comfort, and it gives me a certain sense of comfort to know what my role is in the future of whatever it is that he leaves.
It's really great in your family that you guys have taken the time to talk about it, and I think there was the silent generation, which was like my grandparents' generation, which really didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
And then we have the baby boomer generation, and it's kind of a mix of like, do they feel comfortable talking about it? Do they not? And then kind of our generation, and now I don't want to assume what your generation is, but I just turned 40, so we're around. But like, I'm technically an elder millennial, I guess.
Yeah, what are we? Yeah, it depends where we look.
Right, but there was a statistic recently that more millennials are doing estate planning than any other generation, and
wow.
They're putting estate plans in place, and
Great.
They're really shifting the tide. And I think that transparency does make a huge difference when it comes to wealth preservation, for sure. A lot of people put off estate planning because there's this fear that talking about it is going to make you die sooner, right?
Yeah.
This law of attraction idea. And the good news is I've done a lot of estate planning. I've never had anyone put an estate plan in place and then a sudden accident happened.
Yeah.
And I do think it gives everybody a lot of peace of mind. It's really the greatest gift you can give your loved ones, because without it, they're really left with a hassle. And I have a colleague, her father passed away unexpectedly, real estate investor during the pandemic. And he had nothing in place, and it became like a full-time job for her to try to find everything. It took her 2 years of looking through all of his mail and his computer files, and she's still not sure if she has all of his assets.
Yeah.
There's over $500 million in Colorado's Department of Unclaimed Property. Assets get lost when people die because people don't find them.
Yeah.
There's billions in California. I don't remember the latest. I want to say but I know it's in the billions.
Wow.
That's in your department, in California's Department of Unclaimed Property. So I always say kind of the easiest way to get started is to just grab a sheet of paper or a file folder and put together all your assets in one place and tell people where that inventory is. Most people, when I ask them if something were to happen to you today, would someone be able to find what you have and where it is? The answer is no. And so just taking that simple step, even if you're not ready to work with an estate planner yet, of just collecting everything in one place and letting them know where it is going to make things much smoother.
There's a lot of synergy between what you do and what I do, just in different fields, because we are, we try to preserve wealth also and to grow it in a safe way. It could all collapse if it's done wrong. A lot of people probably ask you, like, well, how much net worth do you have to start estate planning? And it's almost like, I don't know what you think, if you have a few assets, they're easier to lose than if you have a ton of assets. So what would the answer to that question be?
Yeah, I love that question. And I don't subscribe to the idea that you have to have a certain amount of net worth to put an estate plan. I really like to explain to people how asset protection works, how estate planning works, and what the default plan is. And you're absolutely right. Like, a lot of times, the people that are penalized the most are the people that don't have the money, because they don't have the money to get themselves out of it afterwards. The family doesn't have the money to get themselves out of it. So the default, if you don't put an estate plan in place, is that you have a plan. It's just the state's plan for you. And it's going to cost a lot of time, cause a lot of conflict, cost a lot of money, and a lot of assets can be lost. So I really like to explain to people what's going to happen in the default and let them choose. And I have some clients who are just starting out as real estate investors, and they don't have a lot, but they have kids that are minors, and they have drug addicted family members that they would never want to raise their kids, that they want to protect, and they know in a default situation that that's what would happen. I have other clients with, massive estates, over 200 million, and we're doing really complicated estate planning. So really, anyone across the board can get an estate plan in place. It's really about how much control you want and what type of experience you want for your loved ones. Do-it-yourself estate planning, there tends to be a lot of problems. And, one of the basic examples was this case in Texas where a woman owned some real estate, and then she owned a piece of real estate, and then she had a retirement account. She went online and created an estate plan. She's like, I have 2 kids. I'm going to give my real estate to my son, and I'm going to give my daughter my retirement account. Okay. Well, she then lived another 20 years. And as you might imagine, that retirement account was pretty close to empty, and that real estate was worth a lot. And she died, and so her son inherited a really valuable piece of real estate, and her daughter inherited nothing. And so the son was like, well, this is what mom wanted. That's what she put in her estate plan. And the sister's like, I don't think mom would have wanted that way. Right. And so they went into litigation. And so I think, what you don't know, and that's a very simple. A lot of people are like, my estate is so simple, I don't need an estate plan, and that's a really good example of like a simple gone wrong. So I would say, most of the time when I'm talking to clients, it's that first, they don't realize that without a plan it will go through probate. So I think that's the first education. Like, if you don't have a plan, the government has a plan for you, and you're not going to like it. And then that next level is, okay, I know I need to get a plan in place. How do I make sure the plan's going to work? And if you set up a trust, or you set up an LLC, or you set up anything, once the trust is created, you have to own everything in the trust. So you have to, as a business entities, have to sign the ownership interest into the trust upon death is really common. In some states, you can have the trust be an owner of certain entities, but there's some tax ramifications. So just to simplify, and then people will create a trust online, but they don't go and update their beneficiaries to the trust. They don't know that second piece. Right. And so it's as if it kind of negates the whole purpose. You just paid money for nothing, right? You get what you paid for. So
what risks are people not aware of that they wouldn't know unless they came across trouble?
I represented a client who, vice president of a bank, really established woman in our community, and she got sexually assaulted by her doctor. And she made the report to the medical board. She wasn't the only one that came forward. Other people came forward. And so I represented her. And within, a week of her making the report, the doctor had transferred his assets. So he owned the commercial building. He owned other real estate. And he moved all of those assets within, a week of her making her complaint. So Colorado has what's called a Colorado Fraudulent Transfer Act. There's also a federal Fraudulent Transfer Act. And these laws throughout the states and the different federal laws, when someone makes a claim against you, if you start moving assets, there can be a claim that you are making a transfer that's fraudulent. You're essentially trying to get rid of your assets so that this person can't collect from you. Yeah. And there's penalties associated with doing that. There's additional claims that can be brought. So in this case, I found out about it pretty quick. It was in public record and I saw it. And so Colorado allows you to do what's called a prejudgment writ of attachment. So normally we're talking about the only time you get people's assets is when you've actually gotten a judgment. Here I am, I've just filed my suit, and I don't have a judgment yet, but this person I can see is clearly removing all of their assets. Right. And so there's a mechanism where I can go to court, which is what I did, and say to the judge, this person is moving all of their assets, and we're at risk of not being able to collect on this claim. Please freeze all of the person's assets. This is me saying it in layman's terms, but it's called a prejudgment writ of attachment. So we filed that. The judge agreed, and we were able to serve every bank in the state of Colorado, and all of his bank accounts the next day were frozen. And we were able to put liens on all the properties. Now, that was before I even had filed a lawsuit. That was so he was served with a lawsuit, and, the case was resolved. So, and that medical professional had good legal help. So it's something that a lot of lawyers don't know about. It's shocking, but a lot of lawyers don't know about fraudulent transfers. So general rule of thumb, if you have assets and a claim has happened, so the lawsuit doesn't need to occur, but the claim has happened, there could be an argument if you move the assets that there's been a fraudulent transfer.
Okay.
You have arguments against it, right? If you're doing it for other purposes like wealth preservation and things like that. But it can be an uphill battle, and a plaintiff's lawyer can file that suit and get assets frozen like I did. It's also a separate suit where you can get additional damages, so a 3x factor.
Wow.
Colorado has one of the harshest laws. Every state's a little bit different. So you really want to, once a claim has happened, it's always like asset protection seems like overkill until it's too late, and then it's too late, right? Because then it's fraudulent transfer. So the bottom line is you want to put an asset protection and estate plan in place now before anything happens. You're not doing it to fraudulently evade creditors. You're doing it to wealth preserve.
It would seem that that's also an indirect admission of guilt. I mean, if there's no real reason to transfer right after there's an accident or something, if you're trying to protect assets. Can you explain probate and wills and how that plays into if somebody passes away?
So the probate process is the court process that gets involved when you die or become incapacitated. And without any type of estate plan in place, your assets are going to go through probate. And every state is a little bit different about how bad of a process it is. California is one of the most notorious ones that has a lot of challenges.
Oh, really? Good to know. Okay.
So Colorado, we've created some systems in place. We're under the Uniform Trust Act state, so we've made some improvements. But in most states in the country, it's going to cost between 5 to 9% of your estate if it goes through probate, which can be a massive 6-figure or 7-figure or even higher number for most of my real estate investor clients. And it's going to take on average of 9 months to 2 years. Assets can be lost. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to cause a lot of conflict. So wills go through probate because you are leaving instructions to a judge. So how I describe it is right now you own all your assets in your name or in your business names. And when you die, that transfer is going to be made by a judge. They're going to make those transfers for you. Okay. The reason a trust avoids probate is you make that transfer in life. So there's lots of different types of trust. One of the most foundational things for an estate plan is a revocable living trust, meaning fully changeable. You have full control, can do everything that you can normally do in your own name, but you make that transfer in life, and that's how it avoids probate. And that's how you can also put in place additional asset protection, tax savings, other types of strategies that are more advanced to protect those assets. Let's
say you pass away and your kids inherit something. Estate tax, you hear all about these taxes or these assets that people inherit, and then they have to pay a certain percentage of the asset. How does that work versus, irrevocable versus revocable trust?
Yeah, so, big picture, kind of one of the disadvantages of not having an estate plan in place when you have minor children or adult children is that everything's going to go outright unprotected to your kids at age 18. And most of us don't make the best decisions at age 18. Right. If you have no plan in place, it's going to go through probate, so the government's going to take a lot of money. Some states have a state estate tax, and every state has a federal estate tax. So here in Colorado, we only have the federal. We don't have a state estate tax. So federally, the estate tax is 40%, so that's the tax when you die. Okay. However, the government allows you to leave a certain amount without having to pay that, and that's what you call the freebie amount. Right. Back in the early 90s, the freebie amount was $600,000. Anything over $600,000 was taxed at 40% when you died. Wow. Early 2000s, that went up to $1 million. Late 2000s, that went up to $2 million. And then we shot up to 11 million, and with inflation, we're at $12 million today. So now is a good time to die from the state tax standpoint, because you can pass on $12 million without that tax.
Okay, but that's if it's in your personal name, not a trust, or that's
either or. And there's some nuances. So the reason I went through that mini history lesson is you're going to live a long, healthy life. Most of the listeners will as well. We don't know what the estate tax is going to be when anyone passes away. So right now, when the 11 million went through, it had a sunset clause to go back down to 5 million in 2025.
Right.
So any listeners that are at that 5 million to 6 million, now's when you want to be doing planning, because by 2025, if you were to pass away, anything over that is going to be taxed at 40%. Now with trusts, you can do some planning. If you're married, you can double your estate tax exemption. So that double that coupon when the first of you passes, if you structure it right with trusts. And then for my higher net worth, you can also use what's called irrevocable trusts to move some of your assets to minimize your exposure to that 40%. There's some trade-offs, right? The difference between revocable and irrevocable. Revocable is you can change it, you can fully control it. Irrevocable is non-changeable. You can't change it, you can't control it.
Okay.
So everybody on a foundational level, you always need a revocable living trust. Some of your money you want control of on a foundational level. From an advanced planning, so my clients who are higher net worth, who are concerned around asset protection or estate tax, then they add additional layers of irrevocable trusts, which are non-changeable trusts, so that they can reduce their estate tax exemption. But there are some downsides to that. You don't want to put all of your assets in an irrevocable trust because you're essentially not able to control your money, right? Okay. So the government doesn't give you the best of both worlds. You can't not pay taxes and control your money. So there's a little bit of moving things around for that.
How do you, one thing, maybe I'm wrong, but irrevocable, it has its own EIN. Does revocable also have its own EIN?
Yeah, that's a great question. So irrevocable has its own. Revocable, it's your social security number while you're alive.
Okay.
While you're alive, it's your social security, so it doesn't have a separate. And then when you die, it would pass on into an irrevocable.
I feel like the nature of that makes it a totally different animal, because now you're creating an entity, and legally it can survive indefinitely, but and you don't have to pay taxes because you're not really passing it from person to person.
There are taxes that get paid, so the trust will pay taxes.
Okay.
It just has to be part of the strategy of what taxes are you paying when and what. So it's not, you can't move all of your things into an irrevocable trust and no taxes are paid.
Right.
Because the trust is taxed at its trust rate.
Right.
You're just not, depending on how you structure it, you can minimize the state tax at the death. So it's not a one size fits all, and it's like, usually these are bigger. So I always recommend people get their foundational plan in place first, and get their living trust, get their powers of attorney, get their medical choices, get all of that protected. If they have minor children, get their guardianship, all of that. And then the second layer is when we're trying to talk about tax issues, we're doing a second level of planning, and it's a lot of shifting things around and making decisions based on the growth of your portfolio, where you're trying to bring money, and it's going to kind of continue to change throughout your life.
I think it's so interesting what you do, because hearing you talk, it's really like a very holistic approach. You can't talk about LLCs without talking about estates and wills and insurance. It all kind of plays a part of the plan. How do you deal with families that have, a kid that's a rebel, or a kid that went to MBA and has the education and could take over a business? Do you tell them, the kids, what the future plans are without sabotaging the relationship? What do you advise your clients in those kinds of situations?
Yeah, so I have a lot of clients who come to me who have those dynamics where they have children that have different challenges or aren't quite ready to manage the money. And usually it's a conversation about kind of your family's specific dynamic and goals.
Okay.
So you can put someone in charge of the money for your child, whether they're adult or a child.
Right.
So if you want to completely remove all control from, like, there's no trust there, we don't think that the person's, we can do that. A lot of times that's kind of a last resort, right? Because that can cause a lot of conflict and challenges down the road. A lot of times we bring in kind of a professional to be a co-trustee. So you can bring in a private or another family member to be co-trustee and help manage and train and help educate, all of that.
Okay. Yeah, what's interesting to me about contract, because in a way it is a contract, is you could get so creative with it. I think that you can give certain stipulations or conditional things that have to happen in the benefit or in the future trustees' life, like age, certain education, maybe certain experience, in order for them to earn the right to control certain things.
Yeah, I mean, you can really control things from the grave, or or you can be a little bit more relaxed. I was kind of looking at some different statistics around wealth transfer between families, and they've done a lot of surveys, and the more you can educate your children, even from a young age, on things like financial and real estate from a very young age, the better chance they are at being able to kind of preserve that legacy.
It's funny. Sure. That's why I have this show, because you don't learn so many things about generational wealth preservation. One thing that I wanted to say that I wrote in my notes, it's similar to wealth preservation tactics. It's one thing to make money. It's another thing to keep it. And that's the issue. Not that it's easy to make money. Sometimes that's the saying, it's easy, it's hard to keep it. Easy to make it, hard to keep it. But it's hard in both ways. And things are constantly changing year after year. I was watching some video on the state planning new rules this year. What are the trends going forward, and how do you, hedge yourself to protect against them?
One of the things I tell my clients, I feel like a lot of clients who come for estate planning have a similar mindset as me, right? You tend to be kind of more controlling people or planners. Yeah. It's called an estate plan for a reason, right? So one of the things I love about estate planning is it's one of those things, especially during kind of these economic times, that you can control the controllable, and it gives people a lot of peace of mind to put those things in place.
Right.
But we can only control so much. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Back in November of last year, there was a proposal to completely get rid of irrevocable trusts.
Wow.
So everyone was really panicking at that time. The state tax changes, there was a proposal to bring it down instead of in 2025 and 2022. And our office was people were calling us constantly trying to figure it out. So I always like to stay in touch with my clients. So we do, with all of our clients, we're doing check-ins regularly with them, letting them know about any changes in the law. Right now, there's a lot of speculation of where we're going to go potentially with the state taxes and the irrevocable trusts. I think, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you when it's going to change, but I do think people are expecting it to go down. It's already going to go down in 2025, but we'll see.
You're saying go down in terms of the taxable, the freebie part of it?
The freebie, the exemption. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then the percentage always changes, so
right.
It's not always at 40%. So.
Okay. It's got to be really nice to be you, because you have all these families that entrust you for their future. It's a very intimate relationship. What do you love the most about your role, and it's not a job, but what's your passion in it?
Yeah, I think, from the beginning, I was telling you my passion was, going through everything with my family and kind of helping people. I really like that moment, like I was mentioning, of, right now, especially with the pandemic and kind of coming out of it and, going into a recession, people are a little bit on edge. And it's that one thing that they can put a plan in place and feel good about. I have spent a lot of time in litigation. My background was in litigation.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time in conflict and battle. And so I like to bring those solutions to my clients to help them plan in a better way. And I just really enjoy that moment when people know that they've been putting it off for a really long time, and they finally get it done. And they, I have clients that email me and text me that I'm the first person they think about when they get on a flight, because they feel so relieved that they know that if something were to happen, their kids and their parents are going to be taken care of, and their spouse. And so it feels really good to know that they have that peace of mind wherever they're going.
Well, I think that what you said, I think it's so interesting, having someone who does the creating of the estate of the LLCs and that whole ecosystem. When you have experience in litigation, you have experience piercing corporate veils. Can you explain what that means to have, to pierce a corporate veil, and how to keep a company or an estate strong in a position without, vulnerabilities to litigation?
Yeah, so the concept of piercing the corporate veil is you set up an entity. So if you're a real estate investor and you create an LLC to hold a limited liability company to hold one of your properties, the idea is that entity separate from you? Or can they pierce the corporate veil and get into your personal assets? And so there's certain things, it's a multi-factor test, and it's set by state. So here in Colorado, there's multi-factors. Depending on where you have the LLC, it can be different, but they're generally the same in most parts of the country. You want to make sure you're not commingling assets. So
Right.
that's kind of the number one mistake I see real estate investors doing is they go and set up an LLC on LegalZoom to
Yeah.
hold some assets, and then they're using that bank account for the LLC for their personal, and they're moving things in and out, and they're not really treating it like a business.
Right.
And so then you're not going to have that protection if there's a lawsuit against you. So I represented a client who was shot at a nightclub, and he was just an innocent bystander. He was there with some friends, and there was a shooting, and he got shot with some random fire.
Wow.
And we sued the restaurant and bar, and the owners of the restaurant and bar were real estate investors, and they owned a lot of commercial space in other places, and they had everything commingled, so they weren't really
Right.
treating everything as businesses. They had, you know, these entities that they set up, but they
Yeah.
were really running all the cash through one
Right.
entity. So my deposition of the business owners was going through to establish that they had pierced the corporate veil, and I could get into their other assets
Okay.
and the assets outside of just that bar where it happened.
Right.
And so it's things like, are they keeping those corporate formalities? Are they doing their meeting minutes? Are they making sure that they're not moving things in and out between the business without following proper laws around that? So just making sure that you're treating it like a business and that you're keeping those, maintaining everything.
Yeah, I mean, the way we do everything, every property has its own LLC. You know, you have different accountant for not different accountant, but different files for everyone and things like that. But when it comes to it's the liability of it all. Let's say you're a house flipper and you have, you know, 3 houses every 3 years or whatever, and you just flip them. Do you need to get a new LLC for every one?
Yeah, typically people, like, if you're keeping it for, I mean, obviously, this is legal education, not legal
Yes,
advice, so
yes,
you're going to want to kind of chat with your specific attorney, but a lot of times people will have, like, one entity that they're flipping things in and out of, so it's almost like you're running it as, like, a construction type company or a property management type company, and you're running those types of contracts out of that, and then you're keeping the actual property in a different LLC, but normally if it's really quick flips, people aren't putting them in their
Right.
own LLC. It just kind of depends on the nature of what you're doing.
Okay. Yeah, I've always wondered about that because it's short term and you never know what you need to, like, you don't want to underdo your exposure, you know, your legal exposure.
Yeah, and so I always say I don't sell insurance, but the first line of defense is always good insurance.
Yeah.
And I worked in the litigation side. So my background is actually as a civil engineer, and so I worked doing some construction defect litigation. So as a lawyer,
Okay.
so I represented subcontractors that were sued. I represented developers, and then I moved over to the plaintiff side and worked on the suing side. So I've done both sides. And the number one mistake I see people making is they don't have good insurance. So
Wow,
they
okay.
think when I worked for insurance companies, when I worked for developers, and then when I also worked on the plaintiff side. So I would say work with a good insurance broker that I prefer insurance brokers that have the ability, that aren't captive, that have the ability to provide insurance from multiple different providers. And then work with someone that knows your specific risks of your business and make sure that they're including everything in there. So for like the newer investors, I see a lot of times, you know, they're cutting costs, they go online, they buy in a policy, and they don't realize the policy doesn't cover the things that are you're most likely sued for here in Colorado, which in Colorado, unlike California, we get a lot of slip and falls with snow and ice.
Oh, yeah.
I know that's not something you have to deal with in California, but you know, I see people cut corners and not get policies that cover that.
Yeah.
Or, you know, with tenants, here it's a major problem of, you know, we're a big dog loving state. And so if your tenant has a dangerous dog that bites someone and you knew about it and you still rent it to them,
Yeah.
you will be sued as the owner.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure you have coverage for that. So I am one of those few people that prints out the full insurance policy and goes to the exclusion page and goes through with the insurance broker. Hey, is there coverage I can buy for that? Is there coverage I can buy for that?
Right.
And usually it's not that much more expensive to buy that coverage.
Yeah.
Making sure you have those umbrella policies. But like I said, I have a lot of people who are like, oh, I'm covered, I have an umbrella policy. And then they don't realize that that umbrella policy has an exclusion for everything they're worried about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one thing in California that you do get all the time is earthquake insurance. And it's
yeah.
not inexpensive. It's probably the same as the general liability and excess. But, you know, you never know. You have an earthquake and your building falls. One of our buildings it's 100 years old, you know. It's like it's made poured in place concrete. It's got structural cracks in it. So it is something to think about.
Here we have wildfires. I know California have wildfires too.
Yeah. Different states, different laws, different assets in different states. How do you deal with that? What's the best way to deal with having that organized so that you don't have to go to probate in each state, or so that what's the best strategy when you have assets in different states, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So without a plan, you're absolutely right. If you have assets in multiple states and you die without a plan, your loved ones are going to have to go through probate in each state, which means increased filing fees, increased legal fees, increased time. It's going to be a complete nightmare for a lot of your loved ones to have to go through that. Your kids have to go through the cost, the time, and a lot of assets get lost. So typically you want to set up your estate plan in the state that you reside in, that you have your residency. And then you can hold real estate for all of your properties across the U.S. in that. And then when it comes to foreign assets, so for a U.S.-based trust, you can hold assets for all of your assets in that trust. When it comes to foreign assets, you're going to want to put those in a foreign estate plan. You don't want to move any foreign assets into your U.S. trust, because then it increases your tax rate and all of that stuff. So you don't want to do that.
You talked about at some point, or I heard about charging order protections at certain states as holding companies. So what's that mean when, you know, you have one company in another state that is the sort of the organization or parent organization or something of all your LLCs? What's the benefits to doing that?
Yeah, so charging order protection is, can they force you to sell your assets if there's a judgment? So if someone comes against you and sues you and they get a judgment against you, so it goes to trial and there's a verdict against you for some amount of money, can they now force you to sell assets to pay that? And in certain states, they can't. So Wyoming is one state that has charging order protection. Okay. So, and that's just one. Wyoming has a lot of privacy protection that Colorado doesn't have as well, as far as who owns LLCs and those types of things. So a lot of my clients who own multi-state properties will look at having a holding company in a state that has more favorable laws. Right. And normally it's a conversation both of the, what are your long-term goals and what are the tax implications of moving everything under an LLC in that in that state. So it's not kind of a one-size-fit-all. I don't think, you know, you should always do Wyoming. South Dakota is very popular right now. Delaware is very popular right now. Nevada is sometimes popular, sometimes not, because there's some thoughts about some changes in politics in Nevada that might change things. Okay. But a lot of times when you hear that, that's why. And a lot of times I have clients who, you know, are here in Colorado and they only have a few properties, and, you know, they don't, you know, mom and pops, you know, they're retiring, you know, they're not planning to build a massive portfolio. For them, having a holding company in Wyoming doesn't really make a lot of sense, but they go and watch a YouTube video and they think they need to do it. Yeah. And I'm like, you know, you better use that money. I'm happy to create it for you, but use that money to get better insurance, because you're really not going to come against the types of risks that's, the juice isn't worth the squeeze there. Right. But, you know, for clients who have properties in multiple states, you know, thinking through that, what their goals are, and making sure that you choose a forum that's going to give you the best protection. You need to plan properly, and it's different for everybody. One question I had personally too, what are the requirements of not getting your, you know, corporate veil pierced? You know, I know you have to keep minutes, you have to file with the SOS, you know, pay the, you know, annual fees and that stuff. Is there anything else? Yeah, so it's a multi-factor test. It's not, and it's set by state, and it's the things that we've talked about. So it depends what state you have it in, but yeah, you got to keep your corporate formalities, and you have to be operating it as a separate entity. You can't have it just be you. Right. And so, and then it's going to be dependent on the case law in the state that you're in as well. Okay. But those are similar things, like not commingling assets, keeping things separate, keeping the corporate formalities, whether it's the minutes, or if you have a corporation, you're going to have your bylaws. If you have an LLC, you're going to have your operating agreement. Those are kind of getting you started type things to make sure. Okay. And I mean, going back a little bit to the piercing of the or the holding company and the charging orders, I don't know if it was clear about how it's one LLC or individual
is owned by that holding company, and then they're protected from the liabilities of another, certain liabilities. Is there different types of liabilities, property, personal, injury?
Yeah, so with real estate, I like to talk about, there's two different types of liability in general. When we're talking about asset protection, there's inside liability and then there's outside liability. Inside liability is inside liability related to the real estate. So someone can slip and fall on your property and sue you. Someone can't slip and fall on your brokerage account, right? So you have certain assets that have liability just based on the type of asset. And then you have other types of assets that don't have any type of liability. And so we're concerned about, hey, where is the potential for liability inside because of the nature of this? And then if I get sued for something unrelated, so I have a business partner dispute, can they get into certain assets?
Okay. Well, I mean, you're super busy and successful, and everybody in the community respects you. It's always been a pleasure to meet you. What are your daily habits to make you so happy and successful and well balanced in life?
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you. I think one of my mentors taught me the value of time blocking, and it's a little hard to get used to at first, but I'm really regimented with that. So have you done time blocking?
No,
Are you familiar with it? So it's really like my calendar is pretty regimented as far as these are the blocks of times I'm going to be doing certain activities. And if something doesn't fall into that, then I don't do the activities. But on a bigger level of someone, I mean, there's some really good podcast episodes about it, but kind of bigger level, sitting down and writing a list of your priorities. So for me, my priorities are every day I want to spend time with my daughter. Well, what does that actually mean? And a lot of times as entrepreneurs, as business owners, we push our family and our ourselves to the last, and we get like the very last scraps, and it's not usually good. So the idea is to flip that. So for me that's an hour at the end of the day and an hour in the morning, and so it's blocked in my calendar. So before I do any other action items in the week, or before I do it, like I've blocked out my calendar with my time with my family. I exercise every day, so my workout time, all of that is time blocked, and it's non-negotiable. I don't let anything else get in the way of that. And then going through and looking at my business and seeing what's the highest and best use of my time, and making sure those activities are blocked in my calendar. And then you have to give a little bit of windows for other things. But the idea is it feels like really controlling, but it actually gives you a lot more free time and freedom. When I first started doing this practice, they had me go through and, write down how I spend my whole day. And you start to realize how much time wasting you have, like how much time you spend on Instagram or Facebook, or how much time you spend doing things that you shouldn't be doing. Or when people come to you with a task to do, I now have my 5 priorities, and I'm like, is this something that is in my priorities or not? And then saying no. I think as a woman in our culture, I think, especially as a business owner now, I've really had to train myself to say no to a lot of different stuff. And I think, it feels rude sometimes, but that's been the other biggest success tip is
boundaries.
Saying no.
Yeah.
Saying no to things that don't move my business forward, that don't make me happy. So,
well, thanks for coming on the podcast, and got to take you and your husband out to dinner. I'd love to meet him. Hey guys, if you like this video and the content on my channel, I have a newsletter that goes out about once a month. Come to my website, signetinvestments.com, SIGNET investments.com.